Welcome to Created Healthy. I'm Dawn Combs. It's a common idea that God gave us everything we need in nature, but do we believe it enough to walk that out in truth? Often the very same people who say this go looking for answers on how to use food and medicine from man-made sources. Everything man creates comes with a user's manual. Why would God be any different? I challenge you to join me in seeking revelation about our body, mind, soul, and spirit health by digging into His written word and in practicing pure science in the visible world of His creation. Today's readings are bookended with two swords, one sword at the beginning and one sword at the end. And while the stories are intended to be read together and for us to have complete understanding and to look at the entire Bible as we read, comparing what we're supposed to learn with the truth of the whole fabric, it is sort of a happy accident that the particular devotional that I'm using for this podcast has me reading 1 Samuel 18 through 21. And the fact that 18 starts with a sword and 21 ends with a sword is much more eye-catching for me because of that than I think perhaps I would have noticed otherwise just reading 1 Samuel all the way through. So it's interesting to me that the devotional that we choose to use to read the Bible does often help us see a different perspective that maybe we wouldn't have seen otherwise. I've used this devotional, as I may have mentioned before, a few times. So even though I'm using one devotional, this is something that hasn't jumped out to me before. So even using the same devotional over and over again, we're going to see different things. But the thing that jumps out for me are these swords. And in 1 Samuel 18, this is sort of the beginning of the Jonathan and David bromance. Jonathan is Saul's son, and he and David swear a covenant between the two of them that was to last beyond it was to be for generations beyond them, that David's family would look out for Jonathan's family. And we go through, this is where there's trouble with Saul. Saul's jealous, and Jonathan and David have become these lifelong, committed, covenanted friends. And the tangle here of Jonathan being Saul's son and David looking to him for information because Saul's trying to kill him, and David's kind of Saul's extra son, adopted son in a way. And so we're going through all of these scary moments where Saul's trying to kill him and demanding different things, and David jumping out of a window to get away from Saul, and fleeing and making up. And then in 21, he is on the run, and we see him getting to Nob and talking to a priest named Ahimelech and getting a hold of Goliath's sword. So let's talk about these two swords. Jonathan, we have to put this in context of what happened before we read these 3 chapters. And the last time we were reading in Samuel, we ended in 17, where David goes up against Goliath. And David goes out against Goliath, who we know is, the measurements are agreed upon. He's a 9'3" individual carrying the what we know is about, I think, 78 pounds worth of armor, and he's got a spear that some people are estimating at 26 feet, and the head of it weighs 17 pounds to begin with. He's got a sword that is in a sheath on his back, and there is some difference in the scholarship here as to what that sword looked like, but we know it's not a medieval broadsword. Most likely it's something that he took off of a foe, somebody that he had killed in this one-on-one type battle that the Philistines liked to do, and it was sort of a curved, thinner sword. So while it may have been bigger than David necessarily could handle as a teen. It wasn't ginormous and impossible to wield by a normal man who wasn't 9 feet tall. So he goes out against Goliath, and Jonathan is there. Jonathan and Saul are watching on the sidelines. David goes out against Goliath in his sheep keeping attire, and he takes 5 stones, and he presents himself as, I'm out here to show that there is a God in Israel, and he will defeat you. And that's pretty bold. We think that David in this moment, well, from this moment on, I have always been given that David is very intimately connected. He has a very deep connection with God, and he's pretty assured. And that these passages are starting to give me pause. So David has gone out. He's done the impossible. He wielded a stone for God, and God sent that true to Goliath's forehead and caused him to topple. And David defeats Goliath and takes his sword, and he comes back into camp. And I think what's really interesting to me is that it's pretty clear that Jonathan is moved. He is the son of the king of Israel, so he does know God, but it seems that the miracle that happened right in front of him, that God was using David, really got to Jonathan. Jonathan is an incredible man of faith here. He gives David his armor, his robe, his sword, his bow, his belt. He gives it to David, and this is a symbolism here. It's been known in ancient culture. We can see it. It's agreed upon that this is a symbol of Jonathan honoring David, of him giving his fealty, giving his loyalty. These are kingly robes that he takes off, and he could have just taken off his robe and kept his sword. What we do know is that actually there are only 2 swords in Israel at this point, because the Philistines, in their oppression of Israel, have not allowed them to have the forges that are needed to forge a sword. So only Jonathan and Saul have swords. Jonathan could have just taken off his robes and given them to David, and that would have been truly honoring David enough, saying, I am following you, saying, I am giving my place. By everything that he hands to David, he is abdicating his inheritance of the throne. He's recognizing that David is the next king, ordained by God, not him. He would have been the obvious choice because he is Saul's son, and that's the way this royalty passes down. But he sees in this moment of the miracle of taking down Goliath, he sees proof from God that David is the ordained king, and he gives all that he has that is protecting him and that is recognizing him as something more than a mere human. He gives it all to David. And in that moment, to give up that sword is something that is it's a defense. Obviously, it makes you powerful. If you're if you've got one of 2 in Israel, it makes you stand out among everybody else as being able to protect yourself. He gives this over to David. He says in this symbolic token that I think we could read it that I trust you, David, but I think it's deeper. I think Jonathan is saying, I'm going to give up all of my worldly security of this idea that I'm going to be a king and I'm going to be honored and I'm going to be loved and I'm going to be rich and fed, and I'm going to give everything over to David because I trust the God of Israel that just used David to kill Goliath. And so he gives up this sword, and David has the sword here at the beginning, and we watch as their friendship develops throughout, and Jonathan is in a really bad position, wanting to love and honor his father, but also protect his friend. And at the end, in 21, David is on the run, and he is not the man that we see facing Goliath. We see him now doubting whether God is really going to protect him. I think what we're supposed to see here, and this is where again I'm not learned like so many of the other theologians that I'm reading about David in this moment. I see them describing David as this very godly young man who is so assured, and I see David growing in his faith. I see him believing in God, but not really walking everything out in faith. And Jonathan is a contrast here. Jonathan puts everything out there. He gives up everything and gives in to God's will that David is going to be the king and that everything will be fine. But David runs. David runs from Saul, and he winds up at the space in Nob where these priests are, the church in Nob, and he lies to Ahimelech as to why he's there. And for him to lie tells me that he isn't strong in his position with God. He isn't trusting God yet. He lies. He eats the bread that wasn't consecrated for him to eat. He asks for a weapon. So here he is in the story with Goliath. He walked out without a weapon except for the stones and trusted that God would guide that stone to help him have victory over Goliath. But here he is in fear, running from Saul, and he doesn't trust that God has it because he's lying. And he asks for a sword. It's very telling. He didn't need a sword against Goliath, but now he's scared, and he's allowing that to rule him, and he's running with that. And he asks for a sword, and the only one available is Goliath's sword. We're supposed to see in this that God provides in the most uniquely, like he takes a situation that you never would have dreamed later on will provide provision. And I think that we can pull that out of this story. But for me, I think I'm getting right now that David is a vulnerable human. We talk about David being this precursor to Jesus and this model. And of course, Jesus comes out of this family line, but he's an imperfect one. And I think we're supposed to note that. He needs time to grow, and he's allowing that spirit of fear to rule him. And so now he's at a point where he thinks he needs this sword that he disdained and didn't appreciate or need in this David and Goliath moment. Now he's excited to see it, and now he's going to carry this sword because the sword is somehow going to protect him. He's not trusting like Jonathan at the beginning of this reading that he doesn't need the sword because God is going to take care of the situation. I feel like these swords are drawing us to notice a deficiency here in David. And I don't mean to put down David, but I think it's encouraging in a way to see this person that we have heard about over and over again in Bible history. We talk about him in his adulthood about where his failings are, and that he lusts after a woman and puts a friend to death, sends him to the front lines to get him out of the way. And we talk about some of the things that David does that aren't of God and that show his human frailty. But I feel like from the David and Goliath moment, we are building up David as this very assured, walking in God's faith, being fearless person. And I think maybe the Goliath moment shows us a young man who is maybe full of himself, does believe in God, but he isn't completely walking the things that he's saying yet. He goes out because he's blustering. Maybe he goes out because he's worried about his brothers and his father. Maybe he has more confidence in himself in that moment, but he invokes God's name, and God honors that nonetheless, even though he isn't perfect in his walk, even though he isn't fully embracing and living and owning a faith in God that is so huge that he can stand against foes. Because what we see immediately is David falling to the fear and running from Saul and making bad choices and pretending to be crazy so that he doesn't get in any kind of trouble, and going into enemy camps and hiding who he is, and lying to priests and taking a sword because he feels maybe that now he needs to protect himself over trusting God. It's encouraging because I think David is this goal for us, and many of us think that that's unattainable. And in this view that I'm taking right now of these two swords, I see a flawed human that wants to walk in God, that wants to be worthy of being tapped as this king, and wants to be worthy of the trust that God has placed in him, but hasn't fully embraced that faith yet. So it'll be interesting to keep reading 1 Samuel here and see if there are other touch points that support this notion of a flawed younger David. I pray that God is blessing you today, and he brings you back to study with me again on another day. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with a friend. And I'm always interested in hearing what God is laying on your heart. So drop me a rating or review, or join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at Dawn Combs Really.